For nearly half a century, two separate companies existed, on two separate sides of a heavily militarized border, both legally selling products under the exact same name, both claiming to be the true and rightful heir to one of the most respected brands in the history of precision engineering. Lawyers on both sides spent decades, quite literally decades, arguing in courtrooms across multiple countries about which of these two companies was the real one. Picture the almost absurd reality of this situation for a moment. A scientist in, say, a laboratory somewhere in South America or Southeast Asia, neither aligned firmly with the capitalist West nor the communist East, places an order for a precision microscope. The catalog she's holding lists a company called Zeiss. But depending on which distributor she happens to be working with and which side of an ongoing, decades-long international legal settlement currently governs sales in her particular country, the instrument that eventually arrives on her lab bench might have been built in a small town in West Germany, or it might have been built in an entirely different small town in East Germany by two completely separate companies, each insisting, with genuine legal standing behind them, that they alone represented the true continuation of a company founded back in 1846. And in 1990, this decades-long legal and commercial standoff didn't end with a clean court ruling declaring one side the winner. It ended with one half of this divided company essentially absorbing the other, folding its estranged twin back into a single organization for the first time in nearly 50 years. This is the story of Carl Zeiss, one of the most respected names in the entire history of optical engineering, split cleanly in two by the same line that divided Germany itself, and eventually reunited under circumstances that neither half could have designed better as a piece of pure, almost unbelievable historical irony. To understand how a single company could end up fighting its own other half in court for decades, we need to go back to a small optical workshop in the German city of Jena, more than a century before the Cold War even began. In 1846, a skilled instrument maker named Carl Zeiss opened a small workshop in Jena, a university city in the German state of Thuringia, focused initially on producing microscopes and other precision scientific instruments. At the time, microscope manufacturing was still largely a matter of skilled craftsmanship and trial and error, rather than genuine applied science. Lens grinders relied heavily on accumulated practical experience and intuition, without a rigorous theoretical framework explaining exactly why certain lens shapes and combinations produced better results than others. This changed dramatically in the 1860s, when Zeiss brought on a young physicist named Ernst Abbe to help solve exactly this problem. Abbe developed genuinely groundbreaking theoretical work on optical physics, creating mathematical formulas that could predict precisely how a lens system would perform before it was ever built, rather than relying purely on trial and error. This partnership between a skilled craftsman and a rigorous theoretical scientist is, in many ways, the founding template for the entire modern optics industry, the moment when lens making transformed from a craft into a genuine applied science. It's worth pausing here to appreciate just how significant this shift genuinely was for the broader history of science and manufacturing, not simply for one company's fortunes. Before Abbe's theoretical contributions, improving a microscope typically meant an experienced craftsman grinding a new lens, testing it, and adjusting through repeated trial and error, a process that was slow, expensive, and fundamentally limited by how many physical prototypes any workshop could reasonably produce and test. Abbe's mathematics changed this completely, allowing engineers to calculate on paper exactly how a proposed lens design would perform before a single piece of glass was ever shaped. This is precisely the kind of foundational scientific leap that echoes, in a very different field, the engineering breakthroughs Hans Ledwinka would bring to automotive design decades later in Czechoslovakia. A single insight that didn't just improve one product, but fundamentally changed how an entire category of engineering problems could be approached going forward. Abbe's contributions didn't stop at pure physics either. Working alongside a chemist named Otto Schott, who developed entirely new formulations of optical glass with precisely controlled properties, the Zeiss workshop gained access to glass with characteristics that simply hadn't existed anywhere in the world before. Schott's laboratory work involved years of painstaking experimentation with different mineral combinations and manufacturing processes, systematically cataloging how variations in glass composition affected properties like refractive index and dispersion, the exact optical characteristics that determine how a lens bends and focuses light. This kind of systematic, scientifically rigorous approach to material science was, in its own right, just as significant a contribution to the broader optics industry as Abbey's theoretical work on lens design, and the specialized glass manufacturing company Schott eventually founded, operating alongside but formally separate from Zeiss itself, remains one of the world's leading glass manufacturers to this day. A lasting testament to just how foundational this particular scientific partnership turned out to be for the entire field of precision optics. Schott's specialized glass, combined with Abbey's theoretical optical calculations, gave Zeiss instruments a genuine, measurable performance advantage over competitors anywhere in Europe, an advantage rooted in real, defensible science rather than simply superior craftsmanship. There's another dimension to Ernst Abbey's legacy that deserves real attention here, because it shapes so much of what happens later in this story. Abbey wasn't just a brilliant physicist, he was also a genuinely progressive social reformer, decades ahead of his time on questions of workers' welfare. In 1889, Abbey established the Carl Zeiss Foundation, a charitable trust structure that would eventually come to own the entire company, with explicit provisions guaranteeing profit sharing for employees, pension benefits, and, remarkably for the era, an 8-hour workday, decades before such protections became standard labor law across most of the industrialized world. Consider just how radical this was for late 19th century industrial Germany, a period generally associated with harsh factory conditions, minimal worker protections, and industrialists who viewed their workforce primarily as an interchangeable input to be managed as cheaply as possible. Abbey, by contrast, wrote these worker protections directly into the company's governing legal structure, not as a voluntary policy that management could simply reverse whenever convenient, but as a binding foundational commitment built into the very ownership structure of the enterprise itself. This wasn't corporate charity for its own sake. Abbey genuinely believed that a company built on rigorous science should also be built on genuinely fair treatment of the people doing the actual work. And this foundational philosophy would echo, in strange and complicated ways, through everything that happened to this company across the following century, including, as we'll see, giving East Germany's later communist government a genuinely useful piece of pre-existing ideological cover, since a company explicitly founded on worker welfare principles fit remarkably comfortably within a new political system that claimed to prioritize exactly those same values, even as the actual lived reality inside Carl Zeiss Jena's factories under state socialism looked considerably different from Abbey's original 19th century vision. By the early 20th century, Zeiss had become, by nearly any honest measure, the single most prestigious name in precision optics anywhere in the world. Its microscopes were the gold standard in scientific laboratories across the globe. Its camera lenses, produced under various partnerships and brand names, set the benchmark that photographers and camera manufacturers everywhere measured themselves against. Its telescope lenses served astronomical observatories on multiple continents. Consider just how remarkable this trajectory genuinely was for a company that, only a few decades earlier, had been a single small workshop in a relatively modest German university town. Within roughly 2 generations, Carl Zeiss's original craft-based instrument-making business had transformed, through the specific combination of Abbey's rigorous theoretical physics and Schott's systematic material science, into a genuine global scientific institution, one whose instruments quite literally shaped what human beings around the world were able to see and study, whether peering through a microscope at previously invisible biological structures or through a telescope at distant astronomical objects. Very few manufacturing companies in any field, in any era, can claim to have so directly and so measurably expanded the boundaries of human observation itself. And, in a development that would prove enormously consequential during the decades that followed, its precision optics found their way into military applications as well: rangefinders, periscopes, bomb sights, and targeting systems that relied on exactly the kind of rigorous optical engineering Zeiss had spent decades perfecting. This military dimension became particularly significant during the Second World War, when Zeiss's Jena factories became a genuinely critical supplier of precision optical equipment for the German war effort: periscopes for submarines, rangefinders for artillery, bomb sights for aircraft, and countless other applications where the difference between a good optical instrument and a merely adequate one could have direct, immediate military consequences. It's worth understanding just how genuinely irreplaceable this kind of precision manufacturing capability was for any nation waging modern industrial warfare during this period. A rangefinder or a bomb sight isn't simply a piece of glass mounted in a housing. It represents the accumulated result of exactly the kind of rigorous optical theory Ernst Abbe had pioneered decades earlier, combined with manufacturing precision that very few facilities anywhere in the world could reliably achieve at the scale a modern military required. This gave Zeiss's Jena operation a strategic importance that went well beyond its commercial reputation in cameras and microscopes, and it meant that as the war turned decisively against Germany, every major power converging on the collapsing Reich understood exactly what kind of prize this particular facility and the people who worked inside it actually represented. This wartime role, as we're about to see, made the company an object of intense strategic interest to every major power converging on Germany as the war drew to its catastrophic close. As Allied forces closed in on Germany in the final months of the war, all sides understood clearly that Zeiss's accumulated optical expertise represented a genuinely valuable strategic prize, not merely an industrial curiosity. American forces reached Jena first, in April 1945, and in the brief window before the region was formally transferred to Soviet occupation under the post-war zonal agreements, American authorities orchestrated a deliberate, carefully planned operation to relocate key Zeiss personnel, along with some critical documentation and equipment, westward, out of what was about to become Soviet-controlled territory. Picture the almost cinematic strangeness of this moment. Scientists and engineers who had spent their entire careers at one facility, in one city, suddenly faced an urgent choice, made in a matter of days or even hours, about whether to relocate their entire lives westward, away from friends, family members, and colleagues who would remain behind, based purely on which side of an emerging political border they wanted to find themselves on. Imagine being one of those engineers, woken perhaps in the middle of the night, or pulled aside during a workday that had, until that moment, seemed entirely ordinary, and told that you had a narrow window, measured in days rather than weeks, to decide whether to pack whatever belongings you could carry and relocate westward with your family, uncertain exactly where you'd end up or what kind of facility you'd eventually be working in, or to stay behind in the city where you'd built your entire career and watch an unfamiliar occupying power take control of the factory that had employed you your entire adult life. There was no way, in that moment, to know which choice would turn out better. Some colleagues who chose to leave would go on to help rebuild a genuinely successful new operation in the West. Others who stayed would continue meaningful, respected scientific careers within the new East German system, some rising to genuinely senior positions within what would become one of that country's most prestigious industrial combines. Neither choice, in the moment it was made, came with any guarantee about how it would ultimately turn out. Some accepted this relocation. Others, for reasons of family, personal conviction, or simple reluctance to abandon everything they knew, remained in Jena. This split, right here, at the exact moment the war ended, is the true origin point of everything strange that follows in this story. Relocated Zeiss personnel and equipment eventually settled in the town of Oberkochen, in the American-controlled zone that would become West Germany, where they began rebuilding an entirely new Zeiss operation, essentially from scratch. Meanwhile, back in Jena, the original historic factory, the actual physical birthplace of the Zeiss name and everything it represented, remained standing, now under Soviet occupation, staffed by the employees, scientists, and engineers who hadn't relocated westward. The Soviet occupation authorities, following a pattern we've now seen repeated across this entire region on this channel, extracted significant reparations from the remaining Jena facility, dismantling and shipping eastward substantial amounts of tooling, equipment, and technical documentation, much as had happened to other significant German industrial sites in the immediate post-war years. But unlike some of the more thoroughly stripped-down factories we've examined in previous episodes, enough of Jena's core capability, personnel, and institutional knowledge remained intact that the facility could continue meaningful optical production, now reorganized as a nationalized East German state enterprise. And so, by the early 1950s, there existed quite literally two separate companies on two separate sides of an increasingly hardened Cold War border, both directly descended from the exact same 19th century workshop, both employing people who had trained under the same scientific traditions Ernst Abbe had established generations earlier, and both, crucially, still using some version of the Zeiss name. This is where the genuinely strange trademark battle at the heart of this story begins in earnest. Both the Western operation in Oberkochen and the Eastern operation in Jena believed with genuine conviction that they represented the true, legitimate continuation of Carl Zeiss's original company and its scientific legacy. Both had real historical claims to make. Oberkochen could point to the relocated personnel, some of the original documentation, and continuity of the Carl Zeiss Foundation's ownership structure in West German legal terms. Jena could point to the actual physical factory, the original historical site, the majority of the remaining workforce, and the continuous, unbroken use of the Zeiss name on that exact spot since 1846. Neither side was willing to simply concede the name to the other, and this set off decades of overlapping trademark litigation across dozens of countries, each side attempting to establish exclusive rights to sell products under the Zeiss name in as many international markets as possible. Legal disputes of this kind, playing out simultaneously across dozens of different national court systems, each with their own trademark laws, their own procedural requirements, and their own standards of evidence, represent a genuinely enormous, ongoing drain on both companies' resources and management attention across literally decades. Every time either company wanted to enter a new export market, launch a new product line internationally, or even simply update its branding and packaging, the question of exactly what the current legal status of the Zeiss name happened to be in that particular country had to be carefully checked and, quite often, specifically litigated or negotiated before any commercial activity could proceed. This wasn't a single dramatic courtroom showdown resolved in one decisive ruling. It was a grinding, multi-decade administrative and legal burden that both organizations simply had to build into their ordinary cost of doing business internationally, year after year, for most of the Cold War's entire duration. Imagine being a camera retailer somewhere in a neutral country, or a scientific laboratory placing an order for a new microscope, and discovering that there were genuinely two different Zeiss companies you could potentially be buying from, each with a plausible historical claim, each producing products of genuinely high quality, and each locked in an active legal dispute with the other over which one actually owned the right to the name printed on the box. By 1971, after roughly 2 decades of this overlapping legal chaos, the two sides finally negotiated a formal treaty attempting to divide the world's markets between them, granting each company exclusive rights to use the Zeiss name in certain specified countries and requiring different branding in others where both companies continued selling products. This kind of negotiated market division wasn't entirely unprecedented in the history of split or disputed brands, but it remained a genuinely unusual solution, effectively creating a permanent, treaty-governed geography of brand identity that sales teams and legal departments on both sides had to carefully navigate for years afterward. A product that could be marketed straightforwardly as Zeiss in one country might need to carry a modified name or additional distinguishing text in a neighboring country just across an ordinary commercial border, purely because of which side of this 1971 agreement happened to govern that particular market. Sales representatives, distributors, and even retail staff working with these products needed genuine, specific training simply to understand which version of the brand they were legally permitted to represent in which country, an administrative complexity that most companies, fortunate enough to have a single, unified identity, never have to think about at all. This treaty brought a measure of order to what had been genuine commercial chaos, but it didn't end the underlying tension, or the strange, unresolved question of which company was truly the rightful heir to Carl Zeiss's original 19th century legacy. It simply made the two rivals' coexistence more bureaucratically manageable. Meanwhile, back in East Germany, the Jena operation, now formally known as VEB Carl Zeiss Jena, had grown into something genuinely enormous within the East German economy. Not merely a factory, but one of the largest and most important industrial combines in the entire country, what East German planners called a Kombinat, a massive, vertically integrated state enterprise consolidating dozens of related production facilities under unified management. At its peak, this Kombinat employed tens of thousands of workers across multiple facilities, producing not just the traditional microscopes and scientific instruments the original Zeiss name had built its reputation on, but also cameras, sold internationally under brands associated with the broader East German optical and photographic industry. Cameras bearing names like Praktika, produced by manufacturers closely linked to the broader Zeiss Jena optical ecosystem, became genuinely successful export products throughout the Cold War, sold not just within the Eastern Bloc, but into Western Europe, the United States, and beyond, often marketed as an affordable, technically capable alternative to considerably more expensive Japanese and West German camera systems. Amateur and semi-professional photographers across the West, who might never have consciously chosen to support an East German state enterprise, found themselves, quite often without fully realizing it, purchasing camera bodies and lenses that trace their optical heritage directly back through the Jena side of this divided company's legacy. This particular export success mattered enormously, both for the hard currency it generated and for maintaining the Zeiss Jena name's continued visibility and credibility in international markets throughout the decades of the trademark dispute with Oberkochen. And, in a detail that speaks to just how central this Kombinat had become to East German technological ambition, precision equipment used in the country's efforts to develop its own domestic semiconductor and microelectronics industry. This is a detail worth pausing on, because it illustrates just how much strategic weight East German planners placed on this particular enterprise. As the Cold War increasingly became defined by competition in electronics and computing technology, East Germany, like the Soviet Union itself, recognized that keeping pace with Western semiconductor development was becoming existentially important. And Carl Zeiss Jena's precision optical manufacturing expertise, originally developed for microscopes and camera lenses, turned out to be directly relevant to the specialized equipment needed for photolithography, the process used to etch circuit patterns onto silicon chips. Consider the almost poetic strangeness embedded in this particular technological continuity. Ernst Abbe's 19th-century mathematical breakthroughs, originally developed to help scientists see microscopic biological structures more clearly, turned out, more than a century later, to be directly relevant to a completely different kind of microscopic engineering challenge: printing circuit patterns small enough to build a modern semiconductor chip. The same fundamental optical engineering tradition that had produced world-class microscopes a century earlier was now being pressed into service on the front lines of East Germany's attempt to compete in the emerging computer age. A task nobody working in Carl Zeiss's original 19th-century workshop could possibly have anticipated their scientific legacy would eventually be called upon to perform. East German leadership poured enormous resources into this semiconductor push throughout the 1970s and 1980s, viewing it as a genuine matter of national technological survival, a chance to prove that a centrally planned economy could compete directly with the West in one of the most demanding, capital-intensive industries in the entire world. Carl Zeiss Jena's Kombinat found itself, almost by historical accident, sitting at the very center of this ambitious national project, its decades of accumulated optical precision expertise suddenly repurposed toward one of the most technologically demanding tasks the East German state had ever attempted. And in an echo of exactly the pattern we saw with Wartburg's surprising Western export success, Carl Zeiss Jena's cameras and optical instruments continued to be sold, throughout the Cold War, directly into Western markets, earning valuable hard currency for the East German state. This created an almost absurd commercial situation. Western camera enthusiasts and scientific laboratories could, at various points throughout the Cold War, walk into a shop and purchase a genuine Zeiss-branded product manufactured behind the Iron Curtain, in direct commercial competition with the same Zeiss name being sold by the West German company just a few hundred kilometers away, with the ongoing 1971 treaty carefully governing exactly which markets each company's version of the shared name was legally permitted to reach. For ordinary photographers and scientists across the West, this must have been a genuinely confusing situation to navigate. Was the Zeiss lens on the camera you were considering the real one, the one connected to the prestigious post-war West German optical tradition? Or was it the East German version, manufactured behind the Iron Curtain, carrying a slightly different but overlapping heritage claim to the exact same 19th century founder? Photography enthusiasts and professional dealers of the era developed their own informal shorthand for navigating this confusion, often referring to the two companies as West Zeiss and East Zeiss, or specifically distinguishing products as Zeiss Oberkochen versus Zeiss Jena in catalogs and sales literature, a level of clarifying detail that most consumer product categories never require, but that became genuinely necessary here, given the ongoing legal complexity. Serious camera collectors and optical instrument specialists, even decades later, still discuss and debate the relative merits of specific East German versus West German lens designs from this exact period, a niche but genuinely passionate area of collector interest that exists today entirely because of this strange Cold War-era split. Through the 1970s and into the 1980s, though, the same underlying structural problem we've now traced through every single company in this series began to emerge here as well. Despite VEB Carl Zeiss Jena's continued prestige and its critical role in East Germany's semiconductor ambitions, the centrally planned economy simply couldn't keep pace with the accelerating capital investment Western semiconductor and precision optics manufacturers were pouring into their own research and development throughout this period. Western competitors, backed by genuine market competition and far greater access to investment capital, kept extending their technological lead year after year in exactly the fields where Carl Zeiss Jena's Kombinat needed to remain competitive to fulfill its strategic role within the East German economy. Internal Eastern German assessments from this period, similar to the kind of internal planning documents we've referenced regarding other companies in this series, revealed genuine anxiety among planners about East Germany's semiconductor program falling further behind every single year, despite enormous state investment specifically directed at closing this gap. The specific technical challenge here was genuinely brutal and worth understanding in a little more detail because it illustrates just how fundamentally different this particular competitive race was from anything else we've covered in this series. Semiconductor manufacturing capability, unlike building a reliable truck or a competent bus, depends on a continuously advancing technological frontier, where the entire industry's benchmark for what counts as competitive shifts dramatically every few years as manufacturing processes allow ever smaller circuit patterns to be etched onto silicon. Falling behind in this field wasn't like falling one generation behind on car styling or bus comfort features. It meant falling behind on the literal physical limits of what your equipment was capable of manufacturing at all, a gap that, once opened, tends to compound rather than simply persist because each successive generation of chips requires correspondingly more advanced equipment to produce, and equipment investment at the cutting edge of this field required exactly the kind of sustained, enormous capital commitment that a planned economy juggling dozens of competing national priorities struggled to consistently provide. Carl Zeiss Jena's engineers were, in many respects, working at the very edge of what centrally planned Eastern Bloc industrial capacity could achieve in this field. And yet that edge kept receding further behind the pace Western manufacturers were setting, no matter how much resource and priority East German planners poured into the effort. Then, of course, came 1989 and 1990, and the same fundamental exposure to Western competition that had already devastated the Trabant, Icarus, Wartburg, and nearly destroyed Tatra arrived at Carl Zeiss Jena's doorstep as well. But here, the resulting story took a meaningfully different shape than any of the four we've covered previously, precisely because of that strange, decades-long split we described earlier. Carl Zeiss Jena didn't simply face open market competition from anonymous Western rivals it had never previously encountered. It faced direct competition from, and eventual absorption by, its own estranged other half. Following German reunification in October 1990, the Western Zeiss organization based in Oberkochen, backed by the considerably greater capital resources and market position it had built over 4 decades of operating inside West Germany's competitive economy, moved to consolidate the divided company back into a single organization. This wasn't a hostile takeover in the traditional sense, driven by external investors looking to strip assets for profit, the way we saw play out in parts of Icarus and Tatra's stories. This was, in a very real sense, the surviving half of a single company reabsorbing the other half of itself, decades after a war and a Cold War border had torn the two pieces apart. There's a particular kind of institutional strangeness embedded in this specific process, one worth sitting with for a moment. Executives and legal teams from Oberkochen, arriving in Jena to negotiate and oversee this reunification, were, in a very literal corporate sense, walking back into their own company's original birthplace for the first time in more than 4 decades. Meeting engineers and scientists who had spent entire careers building genuinely respected optical instruments under the same founding name, using training and institutional traditions that traced back to exactly the same 19th century source, yet who had lived and worked their entire professional lives within a completely different political and economic system. Negotiating this reunification required reconciling not just 2 separate accounting systems, 2 separate product lines, and 2 separate workforces, but 2 genuinely different institutional cultures that had each, independently, spent 45 years believing themselves to be the true custodians of Ernst Abbe's original scientific and ethical legacy. The human cost of this reunification and restructuring was severe. The East German Combinat, at its peak employing tens of thousands of workers across its various divisions, was subjected to dramatic downsizing as it was reorganized to fit within the considerably smaller, more market-disciplined structure the Western organization actually needed. Try to imagine what this restructuring actually felt like from inside one of Jena's optical workshops during these years. A technician who had spent 2 decades grinding precision lenses for microscopes, confident in the genuine value and prestige of that work within East Germany's economy, now found their entire division's future being evaluated by executives and consultants, applying an entirely unfamiliar set of Western market criteria. Questions about profitability per unit, competitive positioning against global rivals, and return on capital investment that had simply never been the relevant measuring stick under the old planned economy. Some divisions passed this new kind of scrutiny and continued operating. Others, regardless of the genuine technical skill and pride invested in them, were determined to have no viable path forward in a reunified, globally competitive market and were wound down, often within a matter of months rather than years. Entire divisions that had made strategic sense within East Germany's centrally planned semiconductor ambitions, but that had no viable path to competitiveness in a reunified, globally exposed market, were shut down or drastically reduced. The camera manufacturing operations, facing exactly the same brutal competitive exposure that had destroyed East Germany's automotive industry, largely didn't survive in anything resembling their previous form. Thousands upon thousands of workers who had spent careers building instruments under the Zeiss name in Jena found themselves laid off during this restructuring, their expertise in many cases simply no longer matching what the newly unified company's leadership determined the business actually needed going forward. For a city like Jena, whose entire modern industrial identity had been built around this single combinat for nearly half a century, the scale of these layoffs represented exactly the kind of community-wide economic shock we've now seen repeated, in one form or another, across nearly every East German industrial town featured in this series. Zwickau with its Trabant factory, Eisenach with its Wartburg plant, and now Jena, watching one of the most historically significant scientific and industrial institutions in all of German history shed the majority of its local workforce within the space of just a few short years. But unlike the Trabant's clean, total collapse, and unlike Icarus's slow fade into irrelevance, something genuinely did survive this transition, and survived it in a way that connects directly back to the original 19th century company's core identity. The fundamental precision optics expertise that had defined Zeiss since Ernst Abbe's original theoretical breakthroughs remained genuinely valuable, genuinely competitive, and genuinely needed by the reunified company going forward. Jena's most capable scientists, engineers, and technical staff, the ones whose expertise in precision optics remained relevant to the reunified company's actual strategic priorities, were retained and integrated into the newly unified Zeiss organization, working now, for the first time since 1945, for a single, undivided company descended from that same 1846 workshop. This particular outcome, where a core of genuinely world-class expertise survives even as the surrounding organization undergoes brutal downsizing, sets Carl Zeiss Jena apart from the fully hollowed-out fate that befell so much of East German heavy industry during this same period. The difference lies precisely in the nature of what Jena's workforce actually specialized in. Building outdated two-stroke car engines or articulated buses for a vanished Soviet market represented skills with genuinely limited transferability once that specific captive market disappeared. Grinding precision optical lenses to exacting scientific tolerances, by contrast, represented skills that remained directly, immediately valuable to a globally competitive optics company, regardless of which political system happened to be paying the wages. Ernst Abbe's original 19th century scientific rigor, in this sense, turned out to be the one part of this entire story genuinely immune to obsolescence. However dramatically everything built around it, the factory's ownership structure, its national economic system, its geopolitical alignment, changed across the following century and a half. Today, Jena remains a genuinely significant site within the modern, reunified Carl Zeiss organization, hosting research and manufacturing facilities that continue to build on precisely the kind of precision optical engineering tradition Ernst Abbe and Otto Schott helped establish in the 19th century. The decades-long trademark dispute that once required an international treaty to manage has become, in the most literal sense possible, a moot point. Because there is, once again, simply one Carl Zeiss company, headquartered in Oberkochen, but maintaining genuine, substantial operations in Jena, the city where the entire story began. So here's where this particular story lands, and here's what makes it meaningfully, structurally different from every other story we've told across this entire series so far. The Trabant was killed by the very freedom its own people had spent decades fighting for. Icarus was killed by a political collapse that happened in a completely different country, entirely beyond its control. Tatra very nearly killed itself through years of internal boardroom conflict. Wartburg's factory was replaced almost immediately by the very kind of Western enterprise its existence had been organized to compete against. Carl Zeiss Jena's story doesn't quite fit any of those four patterns, because this wasn't really a company destroyed by an external force at all. It was a single company, artificially divided by forces entirely outside its control at the exact moment the Second World War ended, that spent nearly half a century as two competing, legally battling halves of the same original organism, before finally, almost inevitably, being pulled back together the moment the political border that had originally separated them simply ceased to exist. There's something genuinely moving about that particular ending, different from the tragedy or near tragedy of everything else we've covered in this series. This isn't really a story about an industrial empire being destroyed. It's a story about one being reunited with a part of itself it had been forcibly separated from for nearly 50 years, even if that reunion came, as reunions after long separations so often do, at a genuinely painful human cost for many of the people caught inside it. It's worth sitting for just a moment with the strange emotional texture of that kind of ending. There's no single villain to identify here in the way that boardroom conflict served as the clear antagonist in Tatra's story, or the way an entire vanished superpower served that role for Icarus. The Second World War, and the Cold War border it produced, is the closest thing to a villain in this particular story, and by the time reunification finally arrived in 1990, that villain had already been gone for the better part of a year, leaving behind two organizations that had each spent nearly half a century believing themselves to be complete, only to discover, once the artificial barrier between them finally came down, that they had actually been operating this entire time as two halves of something that used to be, and briefly became again, a single whole. That's a genuinely rare kind of historical resolution, one none of the other four companies in this series ever got the chance to experience, for better or for worse. 5 industrial giants now, all built somewhere behind the same broad iron curtain, and 5 genuinely different endings. A nation's own hard-won freedom, a distant superpower's sudden collapse, a company's own internal boardroom warfare, a factory's ground claimed by its ideological opposite, and now, a single company's two halves finally rejoining each other after decades of forced separation. Let us know in the comments which Iron Curtain industrial giant you want us to dig into next, and subscribe, because there are plenty more of these stories still waiting to be told.